Hello, this is a lecture on sources of information. So, before we understand sources of information, we need to understand what an information is. Information is act of telling or imparting knowledge, and we have to understand how does the term information has come into being. So, in order to understand that, we need to understand first the information society. This is a society in which creation, distribution, and manipulation of information has become the most significant economical and cultural activity. An information society may be contrasted with societies in which economic underpinning is primarily industrial or agrarian. Now, first we have to know that information is the knowledge acquired from the others, and it is also about the facts and figures. Now, the lifeblood of society is information, and information is power. After this, we need to understand what an information age is. Information society is also known as society, and it is consisting of computers and telecommunications. We also understand that information age is affecting our lives in many ways. Information age is changing our daily activities and making tedious tasks run more efficiently. The use of information sources available to the users in the desired suitable format, especially the electronic sources, is increasing tremendously. We also need to understand that in information age we can classify the information on the basis of source, nature, level, time, frequency, use, form, and type. The characteristics of information consist of timeliness meaning that the desired information must reach the user within the prescribed time frame. The delay usually destroys the value of information. Also, to understand that characteristics of timeliness is to be effective should also include up-to-dateness of information. Second characteristic is accuracy. Information should be accurate, meaning it should be free from mistakes and errors. Accuracy also means that information is free from biases. Many times, wrong information given to researchers may lead to wrong results in the research. Similarly, the third characteristic is relevance. Primarily, you have to understand that information provider professionals or providers should provide users with the information which is useful and helpful, and they help them for their desired activities. Information should be relevant both to the context and to the subject. The adequacy of information is another important characteristic, which means information must be sufficient in quantity. Information need to be sufficient for the purpose it is generated. There is a lot of information out there. So it is most important thing is to decide what material is to ignore and what is to be used. The next characteristic is completeness. Information which is given to the user must be complete and should meet all his needs. Incomplete information may result into chaos. The next characteristic is explicitness. Information is said to be of good quality if it does not require further analysis. Next characteristic is impartiality and the worth is cost. Worth is cost is so important because nothing comes in this information in this world is free, and information is also not free. It costs money to develop an information organization, its resources, and to maintain them. There must be an appropriate relationship between the cost of information and its value to the concerned user. Some other characteristics of information includes form, frequency, breadth, origin, time horizon. The most important characteristic here is, in fact, all the characteristics are important. The most important is the frequency. It is how often the information is needed, collected, and produced. The breadth is another important characteristic which defines the scope of information. The origin from the source, where it is coming from. Is it from inside the organization or the outside? Time horizon, meaning information must be oriented towards past, maybe towards current event or towards future activities. Next, we need to understand in this topic is information source and information resources. A source is a place from where you can obtain something valuable and useful. A source is something that can be used to perform some function. The sources from where we get information are called information sources, and these comprise of documents, human, institution, mass media like radio and television. Information sources are significant for information organizations and information users. This is because sources indicate the current developments in all the fields. It avoids duplication in research and give answers for specific queries. It helps us to understand some unfamiliar terms, provide the meanings for the terms, and indicate broader view of the subject. Information sources also provide in-depth treatment of the topic or the various aspects of the topic. It can also provide broad overview, historical view of the topic. This is so because these sources are prepared after browsing wide variety of knowledge, and they also examine past studies to predict future trends. Information sources are primarily different from reference sources. An information source is the one which provides us the required information, whereas reference sources are to provide specific types of information which is compiled specifically and designed to provide information in a most convenient form. An information source, thus, is a source from where we get information. It deals with documents and non-documents. Information sources are also different from information resources. Hope this clarifies the differentiation between information source and information resource. Now moving on to the next slide, that is the types of information sources. So as we have understood, there are various types of information sources. While conducting the user requirement analysis, it is important to identify the sources of information. For this, we need to select different sources of information in order to gather complete and accurate information. Information sources are usually organized according to their information content, type, media, or form to cater to different needs of user. The sources of information can broadly be classified into documentary sources and non-documentary sources. Documentary sources consisted all recorded sources of information irrespective of their content and form and comes under documentary. These may be published or unpublished in print or electronic form. It can be books, periodical, magazines, reference books, etc. Similarly, the non-documentary sources can be defined as those sources or resources of information that are not contained in any document. These non-documentary sources comprise of formal and informal. In order to understand the things better, we need to understand what Professor Ranganathan, the father of library science, has classified the documentary sources of information. He has classified them into 4 broad categories: conventional, consisting of book, periodical, maps, and atlases; non-conventional, consisting standards, specification, patents, data; neo-conventional; non-conventional, consisting audio, visual, microforms; and meta documents, consisting of direct created documents without any human intervention. Grogers classified documentary sources of information in 3 parts: primary, secondary, and tertiary. Moving on to understand the primary sources. These are the sources which usually exist on their own. It contains original information, 100% original, based on the first formulation of any new observation, experiment, or idea. The primary publications are those which are published for the first time, supplies the evidence, describes the discovery, makes or drives a new proposition, or bring forward new evidence about previous proposition. It was created at or near the time being studied, often by the people being studied. Primary sources are also fundamental authoritative document relating to the subject of inquiry used in the preparation of later derivative work. For example, monograph, an article in a journal, textbook, sources like books, periodicals, dissertation, report, patent, standards, trade literature, contract proceeding are to be included in this category. Thus, the primary sources of information are the basic sources of new information which have not passed through any filtering mechanism such as condensation, interpretation, evaluation, and our original work of author. Primary sources may also be classic books, letters, diaries, personal papers, photographs, interviews, transcripts, government and historical records, newspaper clippings, and other original sources. There are certain primary sources of information which remains unpublished. Very often, these may be consulted for historical interests. Such material include laboratory notebooks, memorandas, diaries, letters. Companies, the libraries may try to procure such type of material if it comes within the scope and area of relevance of its purpose. The next slide is about secondary sources. These sources concern a particular subject of inquiry which are derived from or are based on the study and analysis of primary sources of information. Secondary sources analyze, review, and summarize the information contained in the primary resources. They summarize, evaluate, and analytically interpret primary material, often by offering a personal perspective. It is thus one step removed from the original source. Secondary source provide second-hand information and thus provide digested information. The secondary publication present the contents of primary documents in a condensed form or listed them in a helpful way. This would enable the user to know the existence of primary documents and provides its access. Secondary sources are often written well after the events they report on and can put past information into its historical context. The main advantage of secondary sources is that they usually present the content of primary document in condensed form or list them in a helpful way so that existence of primary documents is known and access to them is made easy. For example, in science, a primary source is a journal where a scientist describes his research work on the subject cloud computing. A secondary source would be a review article commenting on analyzing the various scientists' research on the subject cloud computing. In this category, the sources to be included are catalog, reference books, indexing and abstracting journals, bibliographies, indexes, abstracts, review of progress or literature, etc. Next, we need to understand what is tertiary documents. Tertiary documents are primarily based on primary and secondary sources, and it serves as a key to primary and secondary sources. These are designed to provide information about information. It also consists of information which is distilled and collected from primary and secondary sources. These are usually compilation from primary or secondary sources. These help the searcher to select required primary or secondary source which will be the most relevant for his purpose. The main function of tertiary sources is to aid the users in using or accessing primary and secondary sources of information. These publications do not carry subject information, but they guide the user to the source where the information on that subject will be available. Since the information is compiled and digested into factual representation, these do not obviously reflect point of views, critiques, or persuasions. Under tertiary sources of publications like guide to literature, guides to reference sources, guides to organizations, list of accession, list of research in progress, yearbooks, directories, bibliographies or bibliographies. The next category, the next slide, is talking about the information cycle. In order of appearance, the first thing to come in information cycle is primary sources. The second to be published are secondary sources, which are compiled based on primary sources. And you can see explicitly from the diagram, the third category is tertiary sources, which are published and based on primary as well as secondary. So the tertiary sources are last to appear in the information cycle and mostly do not contain subject knowledge. The next slide tells you about the distinction of primary, secondary, and tertiary sources in terms of definition, the timing of publication, and the format. So, precisely, I have summarized whatever I have said in the above slides about the three sources, defining the primary sources as they contain raw and original information, which is unevaluated. The primary sources tend to come first in the publication cycle, and the various format in the primary sources which appear in research paper, preprints meaning before publication, letters, conference proceeding, pre-conference volume, diaries, correspondence, fiction, poetry, etc. Similarly, secondary sources are digested information which are analyzed, evaluated, and interpreted. The content contained in primary sources. Secondary sources tend to come second in the publication cycle, and the format of secondary sources are indexing, abstracting, periodical, bibliographies, or reference book. And tertiary sources contains the sources that are compiled, analyzed, and digested from secondary sources, and they tend to be factual. These are the last in the publication cycle. And the examples of tertiary sources are the reference books like bibliographies of bibliographies, guide to reference source, reference books, etc. Now we need to understand what the non-documentary sources are. These are defined as the sources and resources which are not contained in any document, and these are comprised of formal and informal sources. So through this diagram you can understand non-documentary sources consist of, first is organization. So these are the sources which include academic institution, government, ministries, department, research, development organizations, societies, publication houses, international and national agencies, etc. Similarly, human sources are the experts, consultants, resource person, extension works, and even the common human being. Mass media refers to public communication that reach the larger audience, for example, which includes internet, television, radios, magazines, etc. Internet is another important non-documentary source. It is interactive digital media and is different from traditional media such as print and television. World Wide Web is also called web, is collection of website on internet, and it offers information almost all the topics. Thank you so much for listening to the video on sources of information. If you have questions, please post in the comment box. Thank you.